This is PENdulum. Thank you for watching. Today we are talking about fountain pen skipping. I was secretly hoping when I wrote that the pen would skip, but it didn't. So I'd say that most of us in some period of experience have had this incident of their fountain pen skipping. And I'd say, at least for myself, more often than not, it has happened with a new pen. And what I mean by that is usually it's not an issue that occurs with a existing pen that didn't have an issue. I'd say more often than not, at least in my experience, I have the issue of a fountain pen skipping when it's a new acquisition. It's a new pen, or it may be secondhand, but it's new to me, and it's skipping while writing. Now, just right from the beginning, let's clarify two things. Skipping and hard starting are two different things. They have similarities with them, and the troubleshooting is somewhat relative, but they are two different issues. Skipping happens more often than not in the period in which while you were writing in the interim. And hard starting more exclusively happens when you go to write your first word or letter. So that can be when you first uncap your pen and go to write, or it can be when you stop and take a break for a second to write, or it can even be in between words, depending on how severe the hard starting is. So I didn't have any issue there, so I can't, again, there is no example, but hard starting is a different experience. So when we're troubleshooting this, just keep that in mind. Is your pen actually skipping in between words, like individual letters, and during your writing experience? Or is it just when you begin, right from the uncap, right at the first sentence, right at the first letter, the first word, when you pause, things like this? So, hard starting, which is not the main topic today, but that usually happens from ink starvation. So in the break of writing, when you go to start again, there's not enough ink at the tip of those tines to start the writing process, and therefore it troubleshoots and it starts hard or doesn't start at all, because there's not enough ink to provide for the writing experience. So therefore your nib is dry, and you'd either have to prime your feed or wet it with a bit of water, or just try to put some pressure down on your pen to provide more of this capillary action to get the pen to start writing. So that's just a quick note on hard starting. Again, that's not what we're talking about today, but if that is your issue, it could be because the seal in the capping system is not sufficient. It could be because your nib is already on the dry side and it's not having enough ink supply to start your writing experience right off. And it also could be possibly that there's some misalignment happening and that contact isn't happening for a wet enough experience to get the pen started right away. So those are just a few notes on hard starting. And if you have more notes on that, you guys, leave them in the comments below. But we're going to move on now, and we're going to talk about skipping. Haha, look, I got it. So your fountain pen is skipping a beat. So we're gonna be talking about this, and I think when we're troubleshooting, we need to start at the beginning. So when you're having issues with skipping, I would say it is very prudent to start with a nice clean blank canvas. So that means we need to consider the trifecta of the nib, the paper, and the ink. But to start with a clean slate, we need to clean this pen out. That way, you're eliminating any other issues that might be falsely troubleshooting your pen into the skipping arena that you find yourself in. So, disassemble your pen to the degree that you can, but thoroughly flush your system. Make sure you give your nib and your feed a nice clean down, even with a brush, and soak it if it needs to be soaked. You know, it depends on what your maintenance for your pens is like, but basically start from ground zero here. Get your pen nice and clean, start nice and fresh. So soak, scrub, do everything you have to make sure that this is reset and good to go for troubleshooting the rest of the things. So if pen flush needs to be used, do it. If soaking needs to happen, have at it. Do what you got to do. All right, so now the pen is all cleaned and ready to go, and there's really no reason for any issues to happen. So next, what we want to do is you want to make sure that you're starting with a fresh canvas, as it were, with what you're using. So again, we need to consider the nib and the feed. And we need to be considering also the paper that you're writing on and your ink. So let's start with talking about paper. Use something that's very, all these things we're looking for things that are properties that are unproblematic. So Rhodia is a good middle of the line paper. It's not too smooth and waxy, and it's not too coarse or absorbent either. So I think this is a good paper that is very accessible, that most people already have to be testing your writing on. Next, ink. Get a ink that doesn't have any special properties, so no glitter, no shimmer, no special, not waterproof, anything like this, no water resistance. Get something that's what's known as a well-behaved, ink. So personally, I usually go with Pilot Hiroshi Zuku, but Waterman has also come, specifically their blue. I think it's Serenity Blue. So those are things to consider. And then finally, nib and feed. I'm leaving this till the end because there's a lot more going on here that can be complicated. But we want to eliminate the factors that might be causing issues with the skipping of the pen. So these are the things that you want to be looking out for in general. And I have two more. If we go through these and you're still having skipping issues, or I have two more notes as to what might be the problem further. So when we're talking about the nib and the feed, here's some things to be considering. First of all, examine your nib. Have your loop, which I'll get out here. You've already cleaned it, so there shouldn't be any circumstance of having fluff and stuff in your tines or anything like that, but take a look. Make sure it's clean, there's no particles in the tines. Check out your nib. Is it aligned? It is. So, and if you have a good magnification, this is a 10. It might be sufficient, but I have definitely gotten feedback that you're wanting to use like a 20, maybe even a 30, to properly examine this nib for baby's bottom. And baby's bottom is when the tines at the tip there on the inside, so in between the tines, are over polished and they have a round inside of themselves. And this disturbs the capillary action. More specifically, the tines cannot contact the paper sufficiently to draw out the ink and allow it to lay the ink down. So troubleshoot here when we're talking about the nib. Is everything aligned? Can you identify any over polishing or baby's bottom or anything like that? If there's over polishing and baby's bottom, testing after you've tested it with all these, testing with a paper that's a little bit on the coarser side will allow for more contact and traction with the nib. And if that seems to improve it, that might just narrow in and target that, yes, that is the issue. So you can supplement things. Once you identify issues with the pen that is leading to skipping, you can kind of coax or supplement inks or paper or the manner in which you write to improve these skipping tendencies. But my recommendation would always be identify what the issue is and have it fixed. That way you can enjoy your pen for what it's supposed to be and be able to use it without all these different coaxing mechanisms. So again, we're inspecting the the nib. Is it misaligned? Is there any issue with the grind? Those are things that you should be looking for. And also how tight or loose it might be. So if you can see through the tines or there's some separation at the end of the nib, you know I have a problem. Usually that wouldn't lend itself to skipping. That's more like it would be too generous on the ink flow. But if it's too tight and you can't see any light through those nibs, these are on the tighter side, but I'm not having any issue with it personally, then that can definitely be the problem. So over polished, misaligned tines, and if the tines are too tight. Now, if the tines are too tight, that's something that you actually can address yourself if you feel comfortable with that. And there's a lot of different methods out there. Some people recommend pressing down on it like this to spread the tines open a little bit over and over again. Some people suggest that that is too aggressive, and the safer way would be using some brass sheets and shimming it to slowly and carefully open the tines just a little bit to allow more ink flow. So you would be able to tell if this was the case because when your pen does write, it writes very dry. Now, what I would recommend if this is the case for yourself, what I feel most comfortable with is I actually would use my finger to gently open the tines to spread them. And then place this in. And even 2 or 3. I feel more comfortable with that. I think it's the better approach than just pressing on the paper. So basically, give it a push and slip it in. Like this. That's going to start opening the tines up. In my experience, this is actually one pen that I did get dry and that I need to use this method in. This isn't going to be sufficient to get a really tight nib to where it needs to be. You actually need to use 2 or 3, but the method is the same. So just put a little bit of pressure to open up the tines and then slip the brass sheet in between them. If your tines are really tight and this is really the issue, more traditionally you should be starting at the breather hole, working your way down, and then shimming this brass sheet in between the tines. In my experience, when this nib was tight, I think that is more lending itself to doing some damage than what I was was demonstrating, because I don't know, I don't want to risk scratching the nib in the process or the feed beneath from doing that. And I mean, when it's tight, it's just really uncomfortable to do. So if you have 2 or 3 of these, start with one, see how it writes, see the difference. And I actually was able to do this successfully. It was a very dry writer, and I've increased the ink flow. I'm considering increasing it more, but for now I'm happy with it. So if you only have one, you could also kind of bend this in half and then open the tines and slip it in. And then just, you would just leave it there, starting with 30 seconds and upward. Again, this is at your discretion, what you're comfortable with. Personally, these were tight. I folded it over to double it up. I opened the tines manually. I slipped them in, and I left it for 30 minutes, and I came back and checked on it. I started with 30 seconds, but it wasn't enough. It was too tight. And this will vary. This is a steel nib. If you're doing gold, that might be a lot more malleable and flexible than this metal one, so that much time might be overkill. So again, at your own discretion, start slowly with one and low on the timing, and do what you gotta do to get it where you want it, or send it to a nibmeister if you're not into finicking with it yourself. So that's the tines. Now, if your tines are good, there's no misalignment, there's no gunk in it, there's no baby's bottom, there's no tightness. The next thing is to consider the relationship between the nib and the feed. So let's take a look. Again, this one does not have this particular problem, but let me show you a nib that better demonstrates what I'm trying to show, and that is the distance between, or the space I should say, between the nib and the feed. If there's too big of a gap, this again can disturb the capillary action or the ink flow for the pen. Okay, see that? There's quite a significant gap there. And you can also see the ink, like a millimeter behind the feed. But sometimes when the nib and the feed are not in good contact between themselves, when there's too much of a gap, this can give writing issues like hard starts and also skipping. So that's another thing to consider. What the remedy would be for this circumstance is having it heat set. So that's where either a plastic or especially an ebonite feed is subjected to some boiling water and then basically pressed and remolded into the more perfect shape of the nib that it's in partnership with. So this would eliminate the unnecessary large gap between them that might be disturbing ink flow. So that's another thing to look out for when it comes to the nib and the feed. I actually did have that issue with a plastic feed and a gold nib, and I everything. I got the nib tuned, I got it reground, I tried many different inks trying to troubleshoot, and nothing was working. And finally I was like, oh, I don't know why this would be the case, but I think it needs to be heat set, and that on point fixed the problem. So that's just something to be on the radar also. Okay, now when it comes to inks, dry inks would lead themselves to skipping and even hard starts also. In my experience, inks that tend to be on the drier side are like the Pelikan 4001 series. If you have a pen that's just not very wet, that might lend itself to not partning well. So likewise, if you're having an issue with a pen being on the dry side, maybe that's a skipping issue. Maybe you should, start with a well-behaved ink, but if that doesn't work, even a wet or a lubricated ink might address the issue. Again, this is more of like a coping mechanism. It's not actually fixing the problem. It's just kind of stepping in to help the situation. But I would always recommend just getting whatever the issue is fixed. So, but that's something to be aware of. If you've been using dry inks, maybe your pen is not actually the issue. Maybe the ink and the pen are not partnering well together. And I can't believe, let me just say a note on this. I can't believe the relationship that exists with this, because I have never, this is a Pelican 400 vintage, and I've never had an issue. It's a wet writer, it's a super smooth writer, and I've never had an issue with it. But I did put some Pelican 4001 ink in it. This is the olivine, and once in a while I get just a hard start delay, like I'm writing my first letter, like I was mentioning before. So, like for instance, this E, this whole part here would get cut off, even though I was writing with it, and only the E part would be captured. And I had never had that issue. So I knew that it was something with the relationship of that dry ink with this pen, even though it's a wet writer and it has an ebonite beast of a feed. So it's just interesting how these relationships, again, the trifecta, work or don't work together. So those are things to be aware of also, because if I had gotten this pen, never used it before, inked it up with that ink, I would have thought the pen was the problem. Like there's some kind of flow issue, maybe there's a nib issue. I wouldn't have known the difference. But because I'm familiar with this pen and I know that it doesn't actually have that issue, when I ink it up with that specific ink, I can quite assertively say, well, it's because it's a dry ink that on occasion I will get that hard start with this pen. So I know that I don't have to have any hard feelings for this pen. It's just that ink, and either I don't ink it up with that specific ink if I don't want to deal with those issues, or it's just like I know the ink's dry and whatever. Every once in a while it's going to miss part of the letter. Another thing to consider when you're writing and when you're having skipping is the speed at which you write, especially if it is having some issues with any of the paper, ink, nib. Again, generally speaking, the faster you write, the more chance of having little pieces of skipping happen, because it can't keep up if there is any pre-existing issue. So when I wrote the P here, it missed like half of it because the speed that I wrote at, either there's, an incompensation with any number of those dynamics. And in this case, I would say it's not the wettest nib. The ink is a 4001, so it's dry. This is smooth paper. This is not Rhodia. This is Kukoyo. And I was writing very quickly. So, again, those are things to all keep in mind when you're trying to identify the issue of what the relationship is with lending to skipping. So I think those are all things to keep note of and keep in mind. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. And again, you guys, if you think of anything else that might help someone that's having skipping issues, write them in the comments below. But now those two things I wanted to talk to you about furthermore. Is it your fault that your pen is skipping? Is everything totally okay with your paper, your ink, and your nib and your feed? And are you the issue? There's two things I want to talk about on this point. So one is question. Are you using a stub or an italic nib or an oblique? If the answer is yes, consider this. When we're working with stubs and italics and obliques, you have a flat, this is an italic, so it's going to be sharper than a stub, but you have a rather wide, depending on the size of it, but usually 1 millimeter up, unless it's a custom grind on a small, or a fine or a medium, but it's a broad section. And if you're new, especially, you might have some issue making contact with the nib or the paper. So if you're tilted one way or the other, and that nib is not flush on the paper when you're writing, you might have an issue. So if I write like this, nothing's going to happen. And if I have a little bit of a tilt, see how it runs dry? So if you're using a stub or italic or an oblique, those are things that you're going to want to consider. Is it your fault? Are you holding your pen at an inappropriate position? If it's rotated left or right, this flat piece needs to make full contact. So sometimes when you're writing, especially if you're writing quickly, you might have an issue with that. It might not be making full contact, and the issue might actually not at all be the pen, the nib, the feed, the paper, the ink, but you. So if you're practicing, don't be discouraged from using a stub or an italic or an oblique. They're lots of fun to use. They offer a lot of line variation. They're very bold in their characteristics, so they're great. I really like them. But sometimes when you're new at it, you do have to get the hang of it because they're special and it takes time. Another issue, the second one might be, here's a question. I'm going to smear something on here. Do you have oily hands? Do you have oily fingers? Do you have hands that have had lotion on them or moisturizer lately? When I first started, I would notice that by the time I got to the bottom of my page, my pen would start to skip a lot. And like this. Like in weird little beating points like that. And I thought, that's so weird. I don't seem to have any issue, at the top of the page. It writes fine. But by the time I get down to the bottom, it's skipping. Is it my hand angle? Am I changing my hand angle, like cramping myself by the time I get down here? And that's why it's not writing properly. So I'm going to demonstrate. Let me know if this clicks. Writing, 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 writing. And by the time you get down here, skipping. If you have oily, sweaty, moisturized hands, what's actually happening is you're starting at the top of the page, possibly, and your hand and your arm and your fingers are making contact with this page all the way down. You're writing, and they're just dragging across the whole page. And by the time you get to the bottom, this area has been exposed to your arm, your wrist, your fingers, and everything. And it's left a remnant of basically oil or some kind of moisturizer contact all over the page. And by the time you get down here, this ink is having some struggles to basically adhere to the page because it's too slick. And it's skipping. That took me a long time to figure out. And no, I was really frustrated actually now that no one mentioned that to me. Because I would often write in the morning after my morning routine of, you know, brushing teeth, put some lotion on your hands, that kind of thing. And I don't think my hands are particularly oily necessarily, but there's definitely oil on them. So, yeah, from like the bottom third of my page or so, I was always having skipping issues and it was driving me crazy. And I didn't understand. And I was like, it's probably the nib because it was a stub nib. And I was like, I don't know. I'm holding it weird. I have no idea what's going on. So in reality, this was the issue. So what I did to resolve it once, I think I saw a video and someone mentioned in passing, it wasn't even about this, how there was a buildup of oil or lotion or whatever on the page. And that would lead to this kind of effect of just beading or skipping. So I was like, oh, that's exactly what my issue is. So I started purposefully washing my hands very thoroughly with soap to remove any, you know, oil or lotion or whatever that's on my hands. But that's not really necessary either. What you can do, actually, is you can use a little pencil board. Now, these come in various sizes that correspond with notebook sizes. So this is a B6, and they come in A5 and A6 and many, many other different sizes. This is my favorite one to use at present. These are perfectly clear. They're very smooth and slick. It's just plastic. This one actually has a little bit of texture and it's more of a fogged look to it. But I like the texture. It helps just with stability. But now I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to excessively wash my hands to make sure there's no oil on them every time I want to write and make an entry or whatnot. And you basically rest your hand and your fingers on your pencil board, and then you just continue to write. And then you don't have the issue. Now, if you want to test this idea out, you could just use another piece of paper. The idea is just that your hand isn't resting on the paper, on the page that you're about to write on, and being exposed to the oils or whatnot. So you could just use another piece of paper. If you're thinking about trying out a pencil board, I would recommend actually that you just try out a piece of paper first. You can use blotter paper, you can use watercolor paper, you can use cardstock if you want to use something a little bit more sturdy than this. For a while I used some more textured cotton paper like this, and I think that works great too, so that you can test out if you actually like this method. Some people might find it annoying or cumbersome and not worthwhile, and you'd rather just aggressively wash your hands with soap. Or maybe you don't have that issue at all. But if this is going to be a long-term help to you, I'll tell you, I do like the pencil boards better because these get crinkly and inky and they actually don't glide nicely, so you do have to kind of move it along with you. And this, it does move very easily with you against the paper. And they don't get dirty because when you get ink on it, all it takes is a little water and a paper towel or something, and it's clean again. So you buy it once, you use it forever, and they have other purposes too. And I'm going to actually make a full video about pencil boards. I think they're fantastic. There's actually a lot to be said on them because they have a lot of attributes to them and a lot of purposes that you can use them for. including their original purpose, which is to put them underneath your sheet so that you don't leave embedded marks on your next page from pressure or from ink transferring through. So that will fix your oily, lotiony hands with the skipping issue. Okay, I think that's all I have, you guys, on this video for skipping and a few notes on hard starting. Thank you very much for watching. And if you have any more suggestions for everyone else who's watching on addressing these issues, please leave them in the comments below, and we can have a conversation about them. Thank you, and